Okay, it's 2 o'clock. It's my pleasure to introduce Charles Kaplan. I know that the people in this audience are very attuned to the casino collectible Caribbean thing that Charles has produced, and this is just absolutely fascinating. I think his website is almost as fascinating as anything that goes on. So without further ado, Charles Kaplan, and we'd like to hold questions to the end if we possibly can. And if you have a cell phone, off or vibrate would be a great idea. Thank you very much.
Set the stun. Well, welcome everybody. Glad to see everyone here. When they announced last year that the theme for this year's convention was going to be pirates, I'm a Caribbean guy, pirates of the Caribbean. And that's how the idea came together. And I mentioned it to Sheldon. He thought we could do a seminar out of it. So here we are. Let's go. So when you think of Pirates of the Caribbean, you probably think of these guys. But I'll assure you that anything that these guys could have gotten unjustly out of the Caribbean was nothing compared to what these guys got. I don't know, how many of you are familiar with Mayor Lansky? Anybody? A few? Many? I had heard the name, but I wasn't really familiar with who he was. And there were a lot of people who aren't familiar with who he was. But it turns out, I think if you saw the movie Bugsy, when Bugsy was a kid, he had a couple of friends. And his friends were Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. And they grew up in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And it turns out that Bugsy was the bronze and Lansky was the brains. And being Jewish guys, they couldn't get very far in the mafia, so it was fortunate they were friends with Lucky Luciano. And I'll just go through a little bit of what I found out. Going back in the old days of the mafia, this is pre-prohibition. They called the old mafia, was run by the Mustache Petes. They had businesses in the numbers rackets, in loan sharking, in extortion, especially labor extortion, but they were relatively individual gangs who competed with each other and fought with each other. And what happened to change that was prohibition. In the pre-prohibition era, with the individual gangs and they didn't cooperate, the politicians owned the police, and then the police enforced what was going on with the thugs, is what they called the mafia gangs those days. So the politicians really owned the thugs and used them to do their dirty work. But with prohibition, it made the mafia incredibly wealthy. And the mafia then came to own the police and came to own the politicians. So the politicians were paid off for cooperation, and the mafia became very powerful. And along about that time, the Bugs Meyer gang and Lucky Luciano were coming into power, and they conspired to knock out the two guys who were in charge of the old Italian mafia. And they were successful in doing that. They told one guy, I'm going to work with you, I'm going to knock out the other guy, then you'll be in charge of the whole thing. And they did that, and they gained his confidence, and they knocked off that guy. So Luciano and Lansky and Siegel were then in charge of organized crime in the U.S., and what they did was, instead of having individual gangs that competed, they saw cooperation and created what was then known as the National Crime Syndicate. And Luciano was the kind of figurehead, because he was Italian and had more acceptance, but was really Lansky who was the power. He was the brains. He knew how to make money for the mafia better than anybody else, through lots of different activities, but mostly through gambling. And when he spoke, everybody listened. He was the E.F. Hutton of the day. Okay, So that's a little bit of the history. I told you about these things. Now, getting to Cuba and where the casino industry began in the Caribbean. During Prohibition, Cuba was used to run rum and other alcohol into the United States. And Lansky and others set up operation in the rum running days. And that's when they first met up with Batista. So there was a relationship established, and then when Prohibition was over, they used Cuba for other activities, money laundering, running in narcotics, and so forth. So there was an ongoing mafia presence in Cuba, starting from the Prohibition era. And then when Batista came back into power, he had ambitions of turning Havana and Cuba into the Monte Carlo of the Americas. So he knew Lansky. He knew Lansky ran square games. He could attract the high rollers. And he was cooperative with those who helped him, meaning Batista could make a buck out of it. So he invited Lansky into Cuba. He gave him control over the casinos. Could you imagine a mobster being invited into another country and saying, here you are, you run the casinos? That's essentially what happened. And there were a number of Americans running casinos, and mostly were not legit at the time, and he told all the existing casino owners, clean up your game or you're out. So there was something like 13 casino operators at the time, and after 6 months, there were only 2 left. So that's when Lansky began his operations in Havana. Okay, let's move on. In doing my research, and on Google, searching on Lansky, Caribbean, Aruba, and Mafia, and all these different search words, here's a bunch of different individuals that I came up as connected to the Mafia and who were connected with casino operations in the Caribbean. Some of the names there may look familiar to you as having been in Vegas and Nevada. Anybody who was here for Howie's presentation earlier today, he kind of mentioned a few of them. There was Wilbur and Lefty Clark, George Raft, Louis McWillie, Mike McLaney. There was Mike McLaney at one time owned the Carousel, McLaney's Carousel. And of course, Cliff Jones and Jay Kozlov. Cliff Jones was one time Lieutenant Governor of Nevada. Okay. And here's a rogues gallery of some of these individuals. I know Louis McWillie was Thunderbird. I think there's a Thunderbird host chip with his name on it. Okay. I found that one of these individuals, who was a Lansky underling, Dino Cellini, they're making a movie about him, and there'll be a casino type movie, the one with Sharon Stone and Robert De Niro, and that'll be coming out next year. So there's lots of interest in this type of information, and casinos and mobsters. So, and there's evidence of it with a new movie coming out. Where did I get my information? I mentioned a lot of it came from Google and the internet and other sources on the internet. There are a bunch of books that have been published on the subject, articles, Google has a lot of magazine and newspaper articles that you could pull up about the topic. Ralph Pollock has a great book, Casinos of the Dutch Caribbean, and in it he has got a couple of pages devoted to Cliff Jones and Jay Kozlov. Also, Steve Piccolo has a great article that he wrote about Cuba, and it's on one of the gaming websites, if you want to pull it up. And there's even a bunch of FBI files that you could find on the internet connected with the JFK assassination. And there was mob involvement or suspected mob involvement in that, and a lot of the people whose names you see here you also find in these FBI files having been involved with either knocking off JFK or trying to knock off Fidel Castro. Here's some of the books that I took out and got some information from, if you're interested.
There's a book, Lansky itself, that's a real comparison.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, there are a number of books, and I tried to get a couple of different ones in each category. Okay. Here's an example of an FBI file, which is a field agent's report about known American gangsters operating casinos and doing other illegal activities in Cuba. This is the beginning of it, but it goes on for a couple of pages and names a bunch of individuals. And again, you could go onto your computer and search on this and pull it up. Okay? So, we mentioned how things got started in Cuba, and eventually where it wound up was that Lansky owned Batista and had more power than him. When the American government needed favors from the Cuban government, they used Lansky as an intermediary. So it's quite incredible how the mafia came to own Cuba. Okay. Now, my first recollections of Cuba was the Bay of Pigs incident in early 1960s, and it painted Castro and Cuba as communist and anti-American and evil, and that's my first recollections. But is there anybody here who's perhaps a senior citizen who remembers what Havana was like under Batista? Could you share with us?
I was in Havana in 1957, and it was a wild, open town. I was at the Hotel Nacional, and by the way, I was back to Havana about 3.5 years ago, and it was exactly the same. I hadn't been there 40-some years. The same cars, the same buildings and so on. But in the 50s, Havana was a party town. It was a lot of fun, music, dancing, gambling.
Americans went there to have a good time.
We used to go over there to have a weekend, a wild weekend in those days.
And, talking to some people who lived through that era, they said that in the Latin and South America, there were revolutions about once every 2 or 3 weeks because of the unstable governments that were there. And
no, when Batista ran it, it was a wide open town, anything went. And by the way, they had wonderful hotels. The Hotel Nacional is just gorgeous, and they're just happy people. It's great food and beautiful women. It's a great town.
well, from what I heard was, why was there a revolution? And it was because the mafia was getting too greedy, and it was a wide open town, and it was said anything that you wanted in Havana was available for a price. And it was kind of going beyond what the Cubans were willing to put up with. And that's what gave power to Fidel Castro. So he wasn't there to become a dictator. He was there to throw out the American interests in the United States, particularly the mafia, to claim back Cuba from the mafia. That about accurate?
There was the haves and the have-nots in Cuba, and the have-nots revolted and started a movement that was able to...
And it was also that the government and the police and everybody was on the take from the mafia. So, so Castro comes in, there's a revolution. He gets a ticker tape parade in New York City from that. He was not communist at the time. The communism came in when he nationalized the sugar industries. And the sugar lobby then put a lot of pressure on the United States to try and do something, and that created friction, and then that was a break-off in relations. And then he needed to sell his sugar. So who was buying sugar? Russia was buying sugar. So that's how they got led to communism. But it wasn't originally a communist revolution. It was a revolution to get American interests, and particularly the mafia, out of Cuba. Okay. So now I'm going to start looking at places that I know were run or heavily influenced by the mafia, and we'll start in Cuba and then see what happened in Cuba. First, we had the famous nightclubs, and the Tropicana was the most fabulous nightclub anywhere. Anywhere. And then we had Sanssouci and Montmartre were the famous nightclubs.
Are you going into the chips on these?
We're going to...
Some of the most beautiful chips in the world.
Right. And you're going to see at some point, I'm going to make mention of that. So, the Tropicana was run by Lefty Clark. Real name, William Bushkoff. And there are some dice up there that say Lefty Clark Tropicana and some of the chips. And I tried to find some things that related the known connected guy to the casino. And if you're interested in finding out more, there's even a book out there called Tropicana Nights. Now, in the way that things ran, Mayor Lansky, his territory was Florida and Cuba and the rest of the Caribbean. But he also worked in cooperation with others. So while he ran or owned a lot of the casinos, there were also some other independent operators. Santo Trifacante was the mob boss from Tampa, and he was an associate of Lansky, not an underling of Lansky. And he owned the Sanssouci, and he also owned one of the hotels that we'll get into. And if you just look at these chips, look at the designs and everything, and compare it to what you see on chips today as we're going through. Okay, let's go on to the Montmartre. Montmartre was Mayor Lansky. This was his first casino that he ran. And there's some, you could see the molds on those chips are molds that you would typically find in Nevada casinos.
So, can I just add, those, the upper left-hand corner, which is the roulette chip, those chips are gold today. They're $1,000 a piece, $500 a piece.
Okay. Let's move on to some of the hotels. The Nacional was known as the grandest hotel in all the Caribbean. That's the one on the lower right-hand side. That was existing. But then the Mafia went on a construction binge, and they built the Havana Hilton, the Casino de Capri, the Havana Riviera. The Sevilla Biltmore was a Mafia place, but it was an existing hotel before the Mafia got there. And there were other construction activities underway at the time that Castro came into power. So those places never got finished. Okay. Casino de Capri had a front man for the mob who was George Raft. Those who know George Raft, he was a gangster movie actor. He played gangsters in the movies and kind of gravitated to those individuals. He was like the 30s and 40s at the era of Errol Flynn. And when his movie-making career was over, He called on some of his friends. They got him his job as the front man for the Casino de Capri. And the chip in the middle on the top has his picture on it. I was talking to Henry Garrett earlier, and that's a $500 chip. He sold several at that price. Now, some of the stories, on New Year's Day, 1959, when Castro came into power in Havana, the mobs went after the most visible signs of American influence in Havana, which was the casinos. And mobs went to various casinos and busted them up. Went inside, took the equipment out, broke them on the street. Then they came to the Casino de Capri, and George Raft came out and said, "You're going to get in there only over my dead body." And he turned the mob away, and they went on to their next target. So he saved the Casino de Capri from destruction. And I just love that, the drink coaster at the bottom there. What a great design. Okay. There are also some later small key Casino de Capri chips. Those had been ordered, but not delivered before the revolution. So they're nice chips, but when buying them, you should price them accordingly. Okay. Havana Hilton was run by Cliff Jones. And this is, Cliff Jones was the one guy who, when Nevada said, if you're an American operating in Cuba, you can't operate in Nevada, so you have to choose one or the other, he was the guy who chose to stay in Cuba. And Cliff Jones became partners with Jacob Kozlov, and they went into a lot of other operations that we'll talk about. But again, nice logo chips. Okay. The Havana Riviera was Mayor Lansky's dream casino. He built this from design to finish, and it had opened, I think, only 6 months before the revolution. That little bubble at the bottom of the picture of it, that was the casino. And it's something that he had to walk away from. Okay. Sevilla Biltmore was taken over by Amletic Batista. No relation to the other Batista. He was another independent operator. I believe he was from Argentina. And when the revolution occurred, he took refuge in the Argentinian embassy so he could get himself transported back out of Cuba, back to Argentina. So he was Mafia, he's known as Mafia, but he came by way of Argentina. Okay. Wilbur Clark's casino, which was in the National Hotel, and he's got a great set of HCE chips there, which look very much like some of the Desert Inn chips. Going back to Cuba history, in December of 1946, there was a Havana conference where all the Mafia got together, and that's when they decided on casino business in Cuba, and also a very pressing issue that they had to attend to in December of 1946. For those people, and I'll give you a big hint, are familiar with what was happening in Vegas at that time, what happened Christmas Day? Christmas Day 1946. The Flamingo opened, and who opened it? Bugsy Siegel. So the mob knew that he was skimming funds out of it. They know his girlfriend, Virginia Hill, was getting paid off, out of it, and the mob was losing a lot of money on that casino.
They were actually at the overruns. He was spending many times more money than they had originally funded for it.
Right. So he was bleeding them, and they had to take action. The conference wanted him whacked immediately, but Siegel, his childhood buddy, got him some time. And I think the deal was, we'll give him a few months, see how things go, and if they right the course, then he might survive. But the Flamingo, when it first opened, flopped. So that's how Bugsy met his end. So that was business discussed at the Havana Conference of 46. Also what happened was Luciano was put in jail, I think in the late 30s, early 40s, and when World War II broke out, he made a deal with the government to get his allies in Italy to help the U.S. with the war effort.
He also had control over the waterfront with the longshoremen. They were able to make a contract that they didn't go out on strike. He really helped for the war effort, and that was the deal that they made with
Right.
Luciano and deported him, but without a long jail sentence.
Right, so after the war, Luciano was deported to Italy. Within 6 months, he wound up back in Havana by way of South America, and this conference was supposed to be for him to consolidate his power back. But the families in the U.S. who all convened in Havana at the National in 46 decided that he was past his prime and made suggestions that he retire. Or else. Well, he didn't want to retire, and the or else was the Mafia filled in the FBI that Luciano was back in Havana and not in Italy, and then the U.S. put pressure on Cuba to get him deported. And that was effectively the end of Luciano and the consolidation of power for Lansky. Lansky was now, the undisputed national crime syndicate boss. Okay. So, New Year's Eve, 1958. Castro comes into power in Havana with the revolution, and Batista is out. And Lansky's comment about the situation was, I guess I crapped out, because all the casinos were gone. They didn't really close the casinos, but with the revolution, Americans stopped coming to the United States, and the casinos had to close down, and eventually they banned them. So that was the end for the casino industry in Cuba. So you've got all these people, all this knowledge, all this equipment. What do you do? Well, there are a lot of other islands in the Caribbean. And I think Puerto Rico at the time was the only place that had casinos, really. So these operators started moving to other islands. And let's roll. After Cuba, the first place that Lansky went to was the Bahamas. Some of the Lansky compatriots, like Cliff Jones and Kozlov, went to Aruba, Curacao, Suriname, Haiti, Ecuador. I could only find a little information about mafia involvement in Puerto Rico, but I did find some. And then also Dominican Republic, and with Ralph Pollock's help, Antigua. So there were casinos in all these different places that had either started by the mafia or taken over by the mafia. Okay. Curious, when I was doing my searches, I wound up with this guy who was an architect called Mars Lapidus. And they had a listing of all the different projects that he did. And a lot of these projects coincided with casinos that I knew of that were mafia controlled. And those are the ones that are outlined in red. And then I noticed a few that I didn't have any knowledge were mafia connected, but were nonetheless somehow involved, like the Americana in San Juan. So I outlined those in blue as possibilities. But you'll see there, one of his projects was the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami, and that was Lansky's headquarters. That's where all the money came back from the Caribbean, back to the Fontainebleau for the exchange, and then into the American banking system. I don't know if Lapidus was a mafia-connected guy or not, or it just worked out that way, but it was curious that there were so many similar projects that they worked on. Okay. And then I'm just going to allude to some of the artwork on these casinos, casino chips. And they're really beautiful chips. Okay.
What's that second one? That's the only one I don't recognize.
Which one, the Memorial Beach? Antigua. Very few of them around. Matter of fact, the first time I saw it was at one of Ralph Pollock's presentations. Okay. Next. So Cliff Jones and Jay Cassell. Cliff was lieutenant governor of the state of Nevada. He was a lawyer. He was instrumental in putting together a lot of deals to open up Vegas casinos. He was known as the Juice. He was the guy you went to when you wanted to get a casino opened. And at some point, he fell out of favor and was forced to resign as lieutenant governor. And his days in Vegas were done. And that's when he moved on to Cuba. He was a connected guy and was connected to the Kennedy White House with Bobby Baker. And Bobby Baker was an intermediary who worked for Intercontinental Hotels, and Kozloff and Jones got a concession to run a lot of the casinos in Intercontinental Hotels in the Caribbean. You'll find a bunch of casino chips with their initials on it from places like the Holiday Inn in Aruba, the Flamboyant Beach in Curacao, in Suriname, the Torrevieja and Suriname Palace. But they're also known to have run other casinos without their initials on them, like Little Bay in St. Martin, the Memorial Beach in Antigua, and the Aruba Caribbean. Okay. Next. So here are some of those chips, and if you look at the bottom of the chips, you'll see the initials CJ for Cliff Jones and JK for Jay Kozloff. And there are rare dice up there that just have the Jay Kozloff initials on them. Ralph, do you know about those?
Well, Jake was the primary manager of the hotels. So in some places, the Jake was his initials. He was running the show there. Cliff was in the background, quietly, probably in Nevada, but he was running the casinos.
Okay. You know, when you say quietly running in the background, that reminds me about Lansky. Lansky was known to be in the background and as hidden as possible from authorities and from anyone having outside knowledge of what he was doing. And in Howdy's presentation that he did earlier today, he mentioned the Estes Kefauver investigations. And when they produced their reports on organized crime, in particular gambling in the United States, there were 2 drafts and then a final report. And Lansky was the guy running casinos in the United States, legal casinos and casinos in Nevada. And he was so well hidden that he only made the final document. He wasn't even mentioned in the first 2 drafts. Nobody knew who he was. So They were pretty good at remaining hidden. Okay. And here we see some chips from the Flamboyant and Curacao. It's funny, usually the $1 chip is the plentiful chip, but I've never seen a $1 chip from this casino. Have you seen one, Ralph?
I have one.
You have one. You do too? We'll have to talk later. Otherwise, at least just to get a scan to put it on the website. Okay. And then the Suriname Palace. I include this, Ralph includes Suriname in with the Dutch Caribbean. It's in South America, but it's on the Caribbean, so I've included it also. And you see those great sunrise pictures on the inlays on the bottom. CJJK. Okay. And then the other casino in Suriname was at Torrerica, and it had very similar design, but the molds are different. If you go back one, you'll see there the E-wing mold, and if you go forward, the HCE mold. That's the way you tell the differences where these casino chips were used.
What's the chip on the left, the bottom?
That is, and Ralph could probably tell you a better story than I could, but that's the one chip that only has the JK on it?
Is it an H mold? Yes.
Yeah.
It's the H one.
Yeah.
So it's,
They're roulette chips. There should be a letter in the middle, A, B, C.
I think it's a B.
JK, CJ, big B in the middle, and then casino across the bottom.
It's
Right.
a roulette chip.
All right, so it's the only one where JK precedes CJ. That was the significance of it. Okay, I can't see it from over here. There was Aruba Caribbean, which was known to be owned by Cliff Jones. And I found a newspaper article, and it was just a casual reference to casino owner Cliff Jones of the Aruban Caribbean. And a lot of times that's how you find the information. But I guess you do see the dice there with the CJJK. But those dice don't have a location on them, do they? They just have the CJJK?
Well, there are about 6 or 7 varieties of those, and the Aruba Caribbean, one variety has the Aruba Caribbean on it and CJJK.
Okay.
That's a generic one.
Okay, so that could have been used, Aruba Caribbean, but any of them?
Any of them.
Okay. Okay. Here's Little Bay in St. Martin. And the only reference that I found to that was from Ralph's book. I could not find any other information about that. How did you find that information, Ralph?
Well, from one of the croupiers who passed away, he opened up the casino with Jake, and I got the information from him.
All right.
It was a one-room casino, about the size of a 16 by 20-foot size, one roulette table, one blackjack table. Period.
Okay. There's nothing like field work. Some things you just can't find on the internet. Thanks, Ralph. Okay. And Memorial Beach. Now, I had mentioned already Kennedy was involved somehow with the mob in his White House, but also I found that Nixon was involved. And some of us may remember B.B. Rebozo, and was a Nixon friend, and Spiro Agnew had to resign, and so there were a lot of wheeling and dealings going on there that were not quite what they should have been. And I found an article, it was a book called Crime, Big Business, and Watergate, and it mentions how Nixon, who was a poker player, got taken at a crooked game run by Charlie the Blade Tureen, and I found that name, Charlie Tureen, several places in the Caribbean casinos. Okay. Mike McClaney. I found enough information about Mike McClaney that he was a championship tennis player, but made more money playing golf, somehow became connected, and ran McClaney's Carousel in Vegas, and then went on to the Bahamas, and that kind of shacky-looking place on the upper right side was Cat K in the Bahamas, a small private club that was originally opened by a wealthy guy who bought the island, ran a resort on it. One of his customers was English royalty, who suggested that besides a golf course there, they might have a casino. So they put in a casino. It was open for 2 or 3 months in season every year, purely for one guy's, enjoyment. And it operated for a number of years till the owner passed away, and then the daughter was running it, and eventually Mike McClaney somehow got involved in it. But in the process, McClaney became familiar with Bahamas government officials, and you could reach them to get things done that you couldn't otherwise get done, and he became involved in several other casino ventures in the Caribbean. So let's look at some of them.
What years was the Bahamas operation?
For which ones?
The one that you mentioned,
Cat K?
it was like that house with the
Cat K's gambling was illegal in the Bahamas. They granted exceptions to 2 private clubs that catered only to the tourist industry in season. So they're only open for, a couple of months during the season. And those are in the 30s and 40s, primarily. There was Cat K, and there was the Bahamian Club in Nassau. Okay. So I found an article that showed that Papa Doc Duvalier heard about what a good deal Batista was getting, wanted the same kind of deal. He hired an American to be his deal maker, and the deal maker then made a deal with the Lansky folks to get casino operations in Haiti. So McClaney, I believe, got the El Rancho, and again, HCE mold chips. And I believe there was also the Haiti International Casino. There was basically 2 big casinos there. The chips at the bottom are very hard to find, and I have a story about them. A number of years ago, an individual approached me and said that he had some chips from this casino. And I'd never heard of the casino before, never seen any chips from it. So I said, how many do you have? What do they look like? I'll send you a set of them. So he sent me that one $5 and $25 chip. And he said he had about 75 sets of them, and he wanted about $100 a set. So I said, they're really nice looking chips, no doubt about that, but there aren't 75 people who collect Haiti chips. So after I sell about 10 sets, I'll be left with all the rest. And I could probably sell 10 sets for $50 or to $100 each, but I can't buy them all at $100. It doesn't make any sense. So a deal was never done. I offered to buy a set at $100, and he said, absolutely not, send those chips back. So I made scans of them. I since later found a $1 chip, but I don't know if you'll ever find a $5 or a $25, because this individual has them all. That jive with the, make sense to you, Ralph? Okay. I sent him back, and, well, he also indicated that he was somehow connected when I had a conversation with him. No, it's a matter of principle. I don't like to look over my shoulder, wondering who's following me. Okay, so here was the Bahamas Club. That's a picture of it. And you see the old chips from it, and very strange. They had a 5-pound chip that they used there. Bahamas were originally a British location. You won't find another Caribbean chip with a pound sign on it. And you'll notice that somehow it became, from the Bahamian Club, it became the new Bahamian Club. Look at the mold, and look at the inlays, and who do you think made those chips up? And the deal, so this is probably the first thing that the Mafia did, was they moved over and took over the Bahamian Club, made it the new Bahamian Club. And what they did was they went in there not to have a little casino that was only open a couple of months a year, but they made a deal with Bahamian officials to allow them to move the license from there to Paradise Island. Now, what happened at Paradise Island, I think that might be the next foil, if we move on. Here's Paradise Island. So what happened was, Paradise Island is a little island off of Nassau. It's no more than a couple hundred yards channel in between the two islands. And Huntington Hartford, who is the A&P founder, decided he was going to build a resort there. And he built a resort there and didn't do well. And that was because the only way to get back and forth, even though it was a couple of hundred yards, was by ferry. And there was no big attraction there. So he went to the Bahamas government and tried to make a sweet deal to open up a casino there and have them build a bridge from one island to the other island. Unfortunately for him, in the previous election, he backed the losers. So the guys who were in power weren't interested in doing any business with him. And then that gave the Mafia the opportunity to come in. So the Mafia took over control of Paradise Island. The right connections were made. The casino license was moved from the new Bahamian Club over to Paradise Island, and a bridge was built. So we have the Paradise Island Casino, and today that casino is the largest in the Caribbean. It's the Atlantis. And if anybody's ever been there, it's absolutely spectacular. Okay, let's go back one. To the El Casino. El Casino was a casino that the mob built from scratch. On another island called Grand Bahama Island, thank you. They designed this casino, this hotel, and remember, gambling was still not legal. They were using these exemptions to run the casino, those other two casinos, but gambling was still not legal, although it was in the works. They were working their political ways to get gambling legalized. So they designed this hotel, and in the architect's drawing for the hotel was a larger area for handball courts. And while the hotel was under construction, they got the law changed, and those handball courts became the casino. And again, notice the inlay and the molds, and again, similar to everything else that was going on there. Okay. Now, I mentioned about intercontinental hotels, and Bobby Baker and Cliff Jones. Here are some of the other casino hotels that the Intercontinental opened up in the Caribbean, and in all of them, except for the last one, the San Juan Intercontinental, I could find mafia references. So let's move on. Here's a Curacao Intercontinental, a Cliff Jones place, and I did find a newspaper article that showed that he was the manager. And look at the luggage tag that says Hotel Curacao Intercontinental. It'll become familiar with the next few slides. Again, nice inlays. Fine. Here is the Dominican Republic, the El Ambassador, and they have exactly that same luggage tag. I should have included in here, but I forgot to. Again, a Cliff Jones place. Okay, and Jaragua also, Hotel Jaragua. There's that luggage tag. Same design. Nice chips. I found a story of somebody whose father was a casino manager at the Hotel Quito in Ecuador. And in the article it names names and shows that it was a mafia-connected place. Also HCE malls. I found reference to this guy, Rosario Spadaro, and this is now current history. All the other stuff was from the 50s, 60s, 70s. Rosario Spadaro is known to be associated with the Sicilian Mafia. In 2005, he was convicted of money laundering and is currently imprisoned in Italy. And it is known that he owned the Maho Beach Resort, which is now the Casino Royale, the Diamond Casino, which is a casino in downtown Phillipsburg, and the Great Bay Resort Casino, which is called the Golden Casino, and it's suspected that he owns more that is not known about him. He's also known to be associated, if you go back a little bit, I skipped over something, with Jack Abramoff. Jack Abramoff was a lobbyist who recently got into trouble. He got into trouble because he knocked off a casino owner from a guy who was running day cruises in Florida, Sun Cruise Casinos, I believe. Yeah. So there's a whole... No, I don't. You'll need to send me a scan. Okay? So this is a guy who's currently known to be a mafia guy who's presently still the owner of these places. Okay. I remember visiting this casino when I first started in the hobby, and at that time I said, I'm going to St. Martin. Anybody need some St. Martin chips? Just tell me and I'll get them for you from face value. And I walked into this little casino. It's kind of a storefront casino, and I had orders for about $300 worth of casino chips. And first they didn't want to let me walk out of the place. I had to walk out of the place with like my pockets stuffed with chips, my pants falling down. But I did get what people asked for. And those were the chips that were on the tables at the time. Okay. And I've been to this place also. It's a more sedate place. It's one of those places in the Caribbean where the casino doesn't open until the evening hours. So you might be able to play some slots during the day, but you want to collect some chips, you've got to come there in the evening when the casino is open. And I know I've been there on cruise ships, and cruise ships leave at 6 o'clock, so you don't have a chance to get chips from a lot of these places. Okay. Go to next. Okay. There were some independent casinos that I found some mafia involvement with, but nothing tied to Lansky. The Bonaire Casino in Bonaire was known to be run by Bud Sweet. I couldn't find any relationship, really, but one thing, I found an article that said that a known mafia guy was shipping fixed equipment, equipment that was not going to give the players a square deal. And the equipment was bound for a few casinos in the Caribbean, including the Bonaire Casino. And when the guy was arrested, on him he had paperwork with Bud Sweet's name and phone number on it. So that's a pretty good suggestion that he was somehow involved. And the same thing with a couple of other guys. So let's move on. Casino Bonaire has some great-looking chips with the sailboats on them. And it's a small island. Nobody goes there except for divers. They have great diving there. But it's a long way to go. It's about a 5 or 6 hour trip from Miami or Puerto Rico to get there. And it's where divers go. Okay. St. Martin Isle, Milton Parness. Milton Parness, and a way I found out about him was through court records that I found online. There was a legitimate guy who took over the St. Martin Isle Hotel. He was a businessman from Pennsylvania, and he was approached by Milton Parness to run junkets of American gamblers to this casino. And the way junkets run is that the guy who's running the junket guarantees or somehow does the collections of the markers that these gamblers use to spend money at the casinos for the gambling money. And what Milton Parness did was to play the casino owner and tell him that he couldn't collect the markers. So the owner was out the markers, he was collecting them and putting them in his pocket. And the casino owner got into financial difficulty. So Parness was there to lend him money, or people might say loan shark. And pretty soon, Parness was in control of the casino. But he got caught, and he went to trial, and him and his wife and a couple of other associates were convicted. Okay. A guy who's currently living in New York City, who used to run junkets into Puerto Rico, and he was selling these Ponce de Leon chips on eBay, and I got to know him and I met him. And he tells me that his experience is that the people he was running these junkets for were mob connected. And that's the only connection that I have with this hotel and the mafia. Okay. So that's the end of the slideshow. Any questions? Yes.
Earlier, you pointed out that Casino Capri, the chip that you pointed out, that has a map on it, but isn't there some that don't have a map on it? It has an outline of Cuba on the chip. I've seen some without that, without the outline.
I just don't know. I can't answer that.
The whole chip, the inlay, right alongside the order and fly, there's an outline of Cuba.
Okay.
There's some that doesn't.
We could refer to the Caribbean website when I get to that portion. But there's a guy here who's pretty expert on Cuba chips, Henry Garrett. You might want to talk to him about it.
You had mentioned that some are more valuable than others.
Right.
Assuming that the one with the outline.
Yeah, but it's a different mold. the last rack that was ordered that never made it to the casino, it's different looking chips. Okay? It's not the hub mode chips. Okay? Anything else? Don?
Do you have any insight into the relationship between the big nightclubs in Havana and the casinos themselves? Were they like the showroom for the hotel?
They were independent locations.
Sorry?
Independent locations. Yeah, they weren't connected with hotels.
So they share a name only and reputation, I guess.
Yeah. And it's also funny that a lot of those big hotels had the same name as Vegas hotels, like the Riviera. A story about the Montmartre, now that you remind me, was that that was Lansky's place, and there were guerrilla instances of the terrorists, of the revolutionaries doing guerrilla-type operations. And one of the things that happened inside the Montmartre, where the guerrillas knocked off the head of Cuba's secret police or whatever, and that closed down the Montmartre. Okay. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Yeah, eventually I'm going to ask about Joseph Kennedy and his connection with mafia and the Caribbean. But I read the book, Havana Nocturne, excellent book, it's deep background and all this stuff.
Yes.
And Steve Bigelow's article was just a perfect background of that.
Right.
He did a very good job.
I agree. I mentioned it in the beginning of the presentation.
So the author of Havana Nocturne offered that between the mafia and the American politicians in the Caribbean, they just were so indiscreet about the wealth that they were amassing that fueled the revolution too. In fact, wasn't it Tropicana that they drove up with a truckload of pigs and released into the casino?
I didn't hear that story.
I think it was the night of the revolution. Things
Okay.
started to show that. So anyway, Meyer Lansky convinced all these guys to invest all this money here again. And they all just got mad when the revolution social nationalized all the casinos and resorts. So it really put the hurt on the mafia.
Right.
One thing Lansky did do right, well, I understand he was heavily involved in the molasses industry, so when prohibition rolled around, he had control of sugar, which was pretty important to manufacture of liquor.
Right.
And so he made crazy money doing that. In fact, when prohibition rolled into Nevada, what were these drugs going to do? If you were an associate of Meyer Lansky, in which just about everybody in Reno was, and Lake Tahoe, you had it in. Just dial up Lansky, he'd have Joseph Kennedy drive the work truck up to your place. He'd fill it off the back end there.
They say that when Lansky passed away, he had amassed a fortune of about $300 million, and they never found any of it.
I got it. And it's not true. It's 290.
Okay.
It's after 3 o'clock, we better stop here because the Caribbean Casino Collectible Club is meeting in here unless Charles just wants to.
Yeah, we're just going to continue. But anybody who's here, before you leave, we've got some chips.